The president's charge to us is very broad. He asked us to examine ethical considerations of both neuroscience research and the applications of neuroscience research findings. We provided our initial response earlier this year in Volume 1 of the Gray Matters report, stressing the importance of ethics integration early and throughout neuroscience report. And I'm pleased to report, actually, that NIH and other agencies are taking this seriously and convening groups, including bioethics experts, in their deliberations. And that really we shouldn't take for granted, because as Raju and others have pointed out, this is the way the development of genomics actually was avoided, having the sort of heavy hand of regulation rather than actually integrating early on. And so that was basically the headline of our report: integrate ethics and neuroscience and integrate it early. And the rest were details. So we've discussed ethics in neuroscience for some time now, several years actually. We've had meetings on and off about this. We laid the groundwork for this project at meetings in 2011 and 2012, it was a long time ago. And we received the president's charge last July. We're going to bring together the topics that we've discussed over these past few years to formulate some of our thoughts and our recommendations. And there are three particular areas that have stood out in our discussions as ripe for elaboration for different reasons. Some of those areas are ripe for basically showing what the understandings and misunderstandings are, and they may not lead to any strong recommendations other than to educate people on what an accurate knowledge and understanding of this is. And other of these topics may be ripe for some recommendations that are more policy specific. We will see. Here are the three areas. And first, and these are only in order that we're going to deliberate them. They're not in any particular order, except perhaps going from more general to more specific. Cognitive enhancement, we already began discussing. We're going to do that in this session. Second, consent capacity, we'll do that second. And third, law in neuroscience. We have 3 discussion sessions on our agenda today, and I hope that we can devote each session to one of these topic areas. And I would like us to focus on 2 critical questions that we will address in our report. One, what should we say about this issue in our report? And 2, what specific recommendation or recommendations should we make? And let's start with cognitive enhancement, which can include the use of neuroscience drugs and technologies, and it can be on-label, off-label, direct-to-consumer use. Many considerations emerge. We've already introduced some of those considerations in our earlier session, and I thank Lisa Lehman and I thank the presenters, Serena and Margaret, for getting us started here. I want to focus our discussion on what to say about this issue in our report and what specific recommendations we should make. And I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Steve Hauser and Dr. Anita Allen, who will take us away on this. I'll moderate it, but Steve, I understand you're going to start, and then Anita is going to step up to the plate, and then we'll just open it up for commission discussion.
Yes,
and again, anybody who has a question or a comment, please write it down, and we'll bring it up here. So Steve, please begin.
Thank you, Amy. We thought we would finish strong, so Anita will finish for us. And I will be brief and speak mostly about two things. First, a very brief overview based upon what we have heard in numerous earlier meetings and also this morning about where we might focus thinking about the landscape of cognitive enhancement and what we are speaking about. And second, mention some thoughts and ideas for principles and directions that we might explore further. And then Anita will speak more specifically about possible recommendations that the committee could think about. So just to begin, and Amy spoke about this in the introduction, what are we talking about in 2014? What is real? And really there are three things that are real. The first are drugs. These are in several categories. They are the stimulants, methylphenidate, Ritalin, dextroamphetamine, other related drugs, Adderall. These, we know, work through very specific or relatively specific stimulation pathways that might improve focus as well. The second is a broader class of drugs that work on more different and multiple transmitter systems in the nervous system. Modafinil, Provigil is the trade name, or Nuvigil, drugs that initially were developed for sleep, but now may have broader off-label use. The third category are cholinesterase inhibitors, which by their name work on cortical, cholinergic neural pathways, drugs like Aricept, developed for memory impairment, but may also have broader use. And we spoke this morning about other types of drugs, most of which are stimulant-related, that may include the caffeine that most of the commission members enjoyed this morning. So drugs are the first. And I would say also about the drugs that for all of these off-label uses, most of the evidence thus far shows incremental, if inconsistent, effects in healthy populations. The second big area we could call brain stimulation or brain modulation for cognitive enhancement. We've heard about transcranial magnetic stimulation, which depolarizes nerves, it activates nerves. It's FDA approved for depression, but also incrementally useful. Other developing methods, direct current stimulation that changes the baseline electrical level, the resting potential of nerve cells, but doesn't actually turn them on. And then the third, also discussed this morning and earlier, are neuroscience-based enhanced learning tools. In addition to those that are marketed, there are a number in the academic world, some of them video games focused on activating or altering frontal pathways that interact with cognitive learning and behavioral systems. So those are the three. Pharmaceuticals, electrical adjuncts, and enhanced learning through neuroscience. So we've heard many times, and Amy said very clearly this morning, what I think all on the commission agree with. There is nothing inherently wrong with the concept of cognitive enhancement. But one question that we asked earlier are there limits? And if so, what are the limits? Is there an equivalent to human cloning and a decision that no human cloning should take place in the cognitive enhancement arena. Without a clear answer, how will that decision be made, or how will those decisions be made? What buy-in will be important? What if, down the road, certainly not today, we can begin to think about constructing human neural systems, transferring attributes into experimental animals, or even mimicking a human nervous system with software. We've spoken about the risk-benefit profile, which will guide and should guide the use of therapies deemed reasonable. There's probably no such thing as an intervention that's completely safe, and it's an issue of benefits that need to outweigh the drawbacks and honest discussion of what is known and what is not known. We've spoken about other issues, authenticity, potential for coercion, fair access, distributive justice. Does this cheapen accomplishments if it's easier to do things? I think that as we're preparing our report, we should focus on the real issues as well as those that are maybe not so real, and recognize that there are some issues that can be solved by reasonable people and others that will be far more difficult. And to paraphrase what Thomas Murray said to us, formerly from the Hastings Center, a key will be not to handle the marginally useful things that we have in November 2014, but how do we handle the surprises? How do we handle the larger achievements? And how do we proactively prepare for these future developments, which may be unexpected? So I would close by just raising two concepts that we might want to dive in a little deeper as a commission. We might broaden the concept of cognitive enhancement to think about the range of ways that the human nervous system can be enhanced. And this involves, importantly, motor, behavior, as well as cognitive enhancements. There's a lot of science that the capacity to cooperate with others, to delay gratification, even in childhood, to regulate our emotion, may be as or more important than specific elements of an IQ or cognitive response in determining success. And success and happiness are not always linked. So I think that, that we should broaden this concept. Motor enhancements are an area that is being used broadly off-label, and sometimes to the detriment of young people and not so young people. There will also be other attributes that neuroscience can arguably enhance. Some would argue maybe this is not an enhancement. What about short sleepers? We used to think that if you didn't sleep much, this was dangerous, but recent studies of short sleepers show that they live very long lives, they're often successful, and they tend to be inherent optimists. So understanding the clock genes that regulate our circadian pathways, there will likely be novel sleep-promoting or less sleep requiring opportunities. And I think whatever we do should consider a broader range of ideas, as well as the likelihood that better ways to inhibit myostatin and build stronger muscles. We all know about the steroid and related compound issues in sports. And then, so the first would be to broaden the concept of cognitive enhancement to a broader neural enhancement of multiple neural attributes. And the second is, was addressed in part in our first report, but is so important that we cannot lose track of the importance of promoting an informed public. And Stephen Ward from Oregon put it more bluntly than many of us would. A key challenge, he said, is how to deal with the baloney. And I think very similar to our synthetic biology report, how can we speak in a useful way about goals of promoting education, communication, fact-check mechanisms, how to put real teeth into these concepts?
Thank you very much, and bravo. I think you've helped us outline a way of proceeding, so it's really, really terrific. Raju, could we hold and do Anita and then open it up? And you will be...
I don't know what Anita is going to talk about, but I have some specific suggestions to what
Great.
Steve talked about.
Terrific. So you'll be first, okay, and we'll just have Anita go, and then I'll call on you.
Thank you, and I think that much of what I'm saying is going to be an echo to what we just heard. I think that one of the directions in which would be useful to go would be more research about what we know about the prevalence of enhancements and their safety and efficacy. In the prevalence area, I was struck this morning by how little we know about the exact prevalence of usage among high school students or college students or the general public, the worried well, the elderly. To what extent are the newer interventions being used, and by what populations and for what kinds of reasons? So I think that's an important thing that merits funded research. And at the same time, I think as we're looking at new pills and other sorts of pharmaceuticals, we should also be looking at the prevalence of deliberate changes in behavior and environment and education that are aimed at cognitive enhancement. As Steve was suggesting, we could very much stand to explore and recommend that others explore why we care about cognitive enhancement. Why is it important? Is it because we care about addressing congenital problems, defects? Do we care about accident victims? Do we care about mental disorders? Do we care about aging? Knowing why we care might also be helpful to point us in directions about what kinds of other research and ethical measures we need to be undertaking. I think that there is a sense that we care because we think it's a good thing to be, quote unquote, normal. And what it means to be normal, of course, changes. Normal is not exactly an uncritical norm, as it were. But I think people value self-care, they value relationships, they value economic and political independence. And if cognitive enhancements under that name or some other can actually bring people closer to normal lives, that would be a very good thing. So then research on prevalence, safety, and efficacy. An excellent point that was made this morning about safety. If you just think about the safety of taking one methylphenidate tablet every time you have a math exam, it looks like it may not be all that unsafe, but if you think about it in the context of young people who might also be consuming other kinds of pharmaceuticals plus alcohol, caffeine, et cetera, then the safety of the intervention becomes much more problematic. So we need to think about safety of these interventions in a much broader way than just looking at the pill itself or the drug itself. We need to know more about the efficacy. If in fact people don't get as much as they think out of drugs, and the drugs have risks for heart conditions or blood pressure, we need to then know that better and educate the public about the limited efficacy of the drugs that they might be inclined to take. So more research there. Another thing that I think we should be thinking about is the importance of just old-fashioned self-care measures. We focus a lot on the complex new pharmaceutical interventions and brain interventions, but we don't focus that much, maybe as much as we should, on just what things that are within our control that we can do to make our lives better and enhance our cognition. So we should definitely put a priority, recommending that a priority be placed on educating the public and the medical profession as to the importance of exercise and sleep and lead abatement and better education in schools, because of course stimulating young people's brains may be the best enhancement of all. But the behaviors that we can change and address to make ourselves healthier need to be addressed. I mean, if alcohol is an anti-enhancement and for most people, let's cut down on drinking alcohol. So the things we can do that are within our control, the things we can teach people to do that are very inexpensive, need to be emphasized more. And I would certainly want us to be recommending that we do something to improve the priority given to ordinary interventions in this area for these kinds of reasons. We do care, and we can do something about it. Of course, once you have in place access to products that enhance cognition, and you have in place programs and educational schemes that are designed to make people more aware of the value of diet, exercise, sleep, et cetera, questions arise about, well, do all consumers, does everyone have the same access to this kind of knowledge and these kinds of opportunities? Good food is not something which everyone has access to. The ability to sleep well is something which is maybe more available to some people than others. But if there are concerns about access, especially to expensive pharmaceuticals, we need to have, from a justice point of view, some kind of structures in place to ensure that we don't develop a population of the haves and have-not. Those who can afford the great education, the access to sleep, the wonderful diets, and then those who, by virtue of poverty or isolation, have no access to similar kinds of self-help and ordinary remedies to improve and maintain brain function. Another set of issues that we need to worry about were mentioned by Steve, and they have to do with coercion. I mean, I think a lot about this. I mean, once if you have in place, again, whether they're new, novel interventions or just reemphasizing common sense like sleeping more, there are concerns about coercion and whether people who perhaps would not want to adopt an intervention should be, in some sense, coerced to do so, whether children should be, by their parents, coerced to take medications or engage in other kinds of behaviors or strategies in order to make them better functioning from the enhancement point of view. To what extent do we force people? Do we force people to force their children and so forth? Do we force people who are incarcerated? To what extent do we use what we think are proven, reliable, safe, and effective enhancements? Do we use those in a way which involves coercing people who might not want them to nonetheless get on board with the program? And with that in mind, it's important to have guidelines for practitioners and public policy folks, because if we're going to go down this path, there should be uniform standards used by nurses and doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists, so we don't have a world in which some people are because of anxiety, being given drugs of one sort and others are given no drugs or drugs of some other sort. I mean, we need to have it clear what's a reasonable and effective and safe protocol for treating and addressing different kinds of problems. And I think it would be great to give people greater guidance, because even the psychiatry profession itself is sometimes not as well informed about the various options and what the social and medical risks are of those various options. So guidelines for everybody would be helpful. It will also parents need guidelines on when to pursue the medication route, for example, as opposed to other kinds of interventions. And then lastly, I want to say something about this very important topic that Dan raised about ethical assessment. I mean, I think that we need to be recommending that ethicists spend a great deal of time as we move forward assessing whether or not we want to go far ahead in the area of enhancements. Do we want to get to normal, or do we want to get to superhuman? I think we've all been inundated these days by video games and science fiction images of humanity in which human beings are cyborgs who have extraordinary extra-human capacities. Well, if science makes that possible, should we go that way? Should we go that way with humans, with animals? What's wrong with that? Is there anything wrong with wanting to be better than we are? How do we balance the virtues of humility with the very, very familiar hubris that goes along with being a human being as well? And what role will drug companies and the government play in either pushing forward in this very, very fraught with ethical concern domain of super enhancements? How much will they restrain the capacity to go in those directions? And what do we lose by way of human authenticity and character if we allow ourselves to become not just human, but superhuman?
Great, thank you. Raju.
Great. Terrific, both of you. That's a terrific start. I'm going to make a couple of comments that we might want to think about incorporating in our report. I think some of them might be obvious, but let me state them. First of all, I wanted to point out that the way that we're talking about neuroscience now, within the context of our report, encompasses actually lots of areas of science and medicine that were considered to be distinct. I think that, for example, neurology and psychiatry are completely different sorts of entities for a long period of time in how you people train, how they take care of people, and so on and so forth. But now we're emerging that those are not two distinctive fields, but they're the same. Similarly, neuroscience, is a separate entity, studying worms or some other sorts of things. But now, we're trying to bring together all of these different types of things. And of course, other sorts of medical fields like geriatrics and pediatrics are also becoming an integral part of all the things that we talked about. So I think we should talk about that a little bit at the beginning of what it is when we talk about, neuroscience, neuroethics. What are we talking about? And trying to Steve, like you suggested, to make it broad. The second comment that I want to make is that much of the stuff that both of you talked about, we have to put that into context. So what I mean by that is that first of all, we have to define that there are human pathologic conditions under which it is necessary to intervene and to try to enhance cognition, right? So people like me who are getting old, might, because of age, might require, cognitive enhancement. Or people who have a disease like Alzheimer's would need to have a cognitive enhancement. Or in the case of children, we can debate whether ADD and ADHD, whether they need this, but certainly, the people who take care of them think that that such type of cognitive enhancement is important and is necessary. And we have to separate those types of cognitive enhancement as opposed to so-called normal people and how we deal with them. Right. And the other comment that's related, so certainly in the case of disease area, certainly in other fields, for example, if a person is diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, for example, and they think that, they have only 2 months to live, there may be extraordinary types of things, drugs that would be given to those in an experimental fashion that would be considered to be okay, right? Whereas such a drug may not be appropriate for somebody else in another condition, right? So there are certain sets of circumstances when, unusual types of treatments may be okay, right? We have to define that's indeed the case. With regard to normals, so-called normals, if we look at the population, with regard to anything that we talk about, any aspect of the human aspect of it, height or intelligence or cognitive ability, it's a bell curve, the people all over the place, right? And so what are we talking about here? Which of those populations are we talking about, right? When we talk about these types of things. Again, maybe, at one end of that spectrum, it is okay to be able to do certain types of things that may not be okay to do the other end. So unless we truly recognize that there is a significant amount of variation and how you deal with them is important. So, I just wanted to talk about some of the things like the drugs, for example. You give Ritalin to, children who are diagnosed with ADHD or something, and some children respond and other children don't respond. It may have nothing to do with the drug. It may be our understanding about what the disease is, what the underlying basis for the disease is, and what the target for this drug is, right? And that type of thing is happening in other areas of neurology or in genetics that's happening, but we don't know about this. So we cannot paint a broad brush and be able to say that this drug or this other drug is bad or good. But we need to be able to, whether our knowledge base is such that we're not able to identify the right groups of people who would be able to benefit from that. Right? So we have to distinguish all of these different things. And Steve, one thing that, at the beginning of the report, we might consider sort of putting together some of these overall thoughts and define what we're talking about, and maybe even give specific examples, as we have done in other reports, of situations where a cognitive enhancement approach, any of the ones that you talked about, whether they're pharmaceutical, electrical, or enhanced learning things, are wonderful, and where something like that has not been so great. And so that would sort of put everything into relief as to what is really important.
And where there's fear and concern, and we have so little knowledge base that we need more knowledge base there. Good. Dan.
Thanks. I think this has all been.
Dan, John, Christine.
I think this has all been very helpful. I'm just a little concerned about the ambiguity in the phrase sort of per se permissible, because I'm not sure that it captures exactly what we want to say or has a danger of being misinterpreted. So I think that what we probably want to say is that not all forms of enhancement are immoral, right? I think that that's really what we want to say. But I think we also want to avoid the sort of common fallacy of the continuum, which is very common in this sort of enhancement debate, which is a version of the Sorites problem. Like how many grains of sand make a heap, right? At some point, there will be a heap, but where do we draw that line? And I think we don't want to say, or give the impression that we're saying that, well, drinking coffee is okay, therefore implanting transhumanizing, brain chips in everybody's brains is okay as long as we have equal access to them, right? And I don't think that's what we want to say. So I think we've got to be careful to sort of point out that fallacy is common, while still saying that, there are certain forms of enhancement that ought to be considered morally permissible. And then we can focus on the kinds of issues that I think, are the really important ones that I've heard, like, the questions of, whose choice is it to be enhanced? Is it, coercion, manipulation questions, the short-term versus long-term questions, whether, we're bypassing these deep and broadly applicable capacities to do the same thing, safety and alternatives, the questions of unfair advantage, and the sort of arms race that can lead to when one person, gets access to this and the next person needs to in order to just keep up. Questions of moral enhancement, which might be part of, considered sometimes part of cognitive enhancement, et cetera. So I think those are the real issues we want to focus on. And just my concern is that the per se permissible language can be misinterpreted, I think, as the sort of fallacy of the continuum, and I want to make sure we avoid that in this discussion. So.
Good. So we can say it. I don't think we want to say it so it suggests that the default is it's suspect. So we can say enhancing cognition is not in itself suspect. In itself, it's not suspect. Then you have to ask questions about each kind. One of the things I liked about what Steve said that we hadn't said before, and I think nothing has been said to disagree with it, so I just want to make sure, is that it would be important if we, since we're focusing, because it's neuroscience, on the issues that have been out there about cognitive enhancement, we not just focus on the cognitive enhancement, but also the other forms of neural enhancement, which, because I think an unintended side effect of focusing on this cognitive enhancement, it's totally unintended because the critics have this side effect, I think, is that people think, oh, that must be something a lot of people think is good, and it makes cognitive enhancement seem more attractive than some other forms of enhancing your ability to control your motor skills, for example. So I just think it's important given we're talking about neuroscience, not just to talk about.
Certainly, I'd agree with broadening it, but the same sort of question of the fallacy of the continuum applies to these other kinds of enhancements as well. So I just want to make sure that it's so common in the literature that I really think it would be very valuable for us to explicitly repudiate that.
Yeah, good. Jim had a question.
Actually, it was your question. And
Okay.
You did well, but I just want to make sure that we actually talk about this, Dan, to hear Amy say, and others, enhancements in and of themselves are not immoral, nothing wrong with that. And then to hear you begin that same paragraph by saying not all enhancements are immoral. We're going to have to come to a place where are we jumping on this?
So maybe my sort of take on it might be, if you wanted to put a positive spin on the way I do it, is plenty of forms of cognitive enhancement are morally innocent. That's
Good. That's fine. Just as long as we don't phrase it to make the default it's suspect, okay? Because, and also it falls into the fallacy of the term is such a loaded term. We have to be careful of it. Okay, John.
Well, first, thank you for framing the issues so beautifully. I have to do something similar at 2:30, and now I've got serious performance anxiety.
Some people
but enough
may have
about
some
me.
off-label drugs for you.
So I want to circle back on a theme that Raju was articulating, making distinctions between interventions that might bring people up to something like normalcy versus interventions that take people well beyond. So I think so I think that there's a need in this report for a fair amount of conceptual clarification. Okay, so just the definition of enhancement is one area that needs some serious work. Another is the distinction between enhancement and treatment, or enhancement and therapy. I mean, there have been a lot of efforts to drive a clear wedge between those notions, and to try to develop a kind of value-free conception of disease or health. But I've always suspected that those are, infiltrating various value judgments at various points. So, and the treatment enhancement distinction pops up, I think, in a lot of the enhancement literature. So you have to be self-conscious about invoking those kinds of distinctions, and self-conscious about what kind of implications they might have. Now, another just short point I wanted to make with regard to Stephen's attempt to broaden the scope of this. In the literature of enhancement, there's been quite a bit of talk in the last couple of years about moral enhancement, okay? So not just cognitive, but moral. And so it's not just, motor activities, it's not just cognitive, but it's actually sort of attempting by whatever means to make us more altruistic, less violent, whatever, okay? And I think that could be a theme that could be tucked into this section. I think this could be an interesting thing. I'm actually going to be talking about this in my current seminar on neuroscience and ethics in a couple of weeks. But I've got to do that reading soon, yeah.
Thank you, thank you. Christine?
So, thank you to Steve and Anita, and if you wait long enough on the queue, your questions have already, or your opinions have already been expressed. What I wanted to say was, I think, somewhat similar to what John just said, and also building on Raju's comments. I think one of the things we can do, Amy, you asked, what can we do? One of the things we can do is be very clear about what we mean by enhancement, because there is a danger, I think, in the sort of common understanding of what that means sort of above normal or from normal better. And I think if that's what we want to focus on, then we're sort of suggesting in a sort of indirect way that all of the very important work that some of these modalities can be used for to maintain cognitive function or restore cognitive function or behavioral or motor, or whichever one we're going to focus on, are less important, or we already know more about them or something like that. And I don't think that's what we want to
No,
convey.
So I think Steve captured this really well in his outline, and we're going to have to be explicit about this. We do not want to subscribe to, buy into the most common aspect of the literature, which is there's this just clear distinction between enhancing cognition above normal and therapy below normal. Now, we also don't want to suggest there's just some mindless continuum, and Steve outlined it in a way that doesn't buy into that. And I think we're going to have to say up front, we're taking on this issue in order to debunk some of the misunderstandings out there that are ethical misunderstandings as well as, if you will, practical cognitive. They're cognitive/ethical. Let me put it this way. I think that the term, the way it's commonly used, is misleading. And it's misleading in a way that's very unproductive of thinking clearly about the ethics of it and what's good and what's not so good, what's better and what's worse. So I think we can do that. But to ignore the topic because it's misleading would just leave it out there the way it is.
I didn't in
Yeah, I
any way
know.
mean we should ignore it. I think, though, that we have to be cognizant of the fact that the term has a loaded meaning, and
That's
we
what-
have
and
to
we
be,
should say that.
We have to be really clear about what we mean by it and
Right.
what we're trying to say. Because so many of the things, the recommendations, I think that Anita suggested, more research, fair access, and things like that are relevant to all of the above and sort of, all of the possible ways that we could think about what enhancement
Yeah.
might mean without having to get into the quagmire of where's the line between treatment and enhancement, which I think is, people have been working on for a long time and not solved.
Yeah, and I think a big focus is what Steve said, promoting an informed public, and that's a key challenge.
Yeah. Can I just add one other sort of minor thing? I think we've talked a lot about research to investigate benefits, efficacy, risks, side effects, those kinds of things. I think that's all really important. The one thing I wondered about was cost effectiveness, whether we should say anything about that.
I don't know. Nita?
So first, thank you to both Steve and Anita for, I think, highlighting this in a very useful way to frame the conversation. I'm going to express my reservation again about how much we can say meaningfully in this topic, given that it's probably one of the better and more fully debated topics in neuroethics. And I would want for us to be very careful about thinking about what can we as a commission say that's different and novel and useful at this level, to whom are we directing those recommendations, and what's the purpose of the recommendations. I think some of the things that Steve outlined are useful and in accord with things that we've said in the past that could be helpful, but let me speak about some of the issues that have been raised more specifically. So first, I agree entirely that we should broaden the scope, but I wouldn't even use the word enhancement, because the broad topic which we're talking about are different forms of neuromodification, and how you characterize things as neuromodification really could be enhancements, could be diminishments. So, one example is the use of something like propranolol to try to decrease fear memories, and to do so as a way to prevent the development of PTSD in trauma victims. That's a form of enhancement in that they are less likely to develop PTSD. It's also a form of diminishment in that they are selectively diminishing certain memories and selectively dampening certain memories. There's social disinhibition, which is a positive side effect of alcohol, but it is certainly a diminishment in some form rather than an enhancement in every form. And so trying to draw the line between what is enhancement versus what is therapy versus what is diminishment versus what is modification, I think they're pretty artificial lines, and it's a debate that has been had, and one that I think we don't want to end up using a term that has simply become a term of art that doesn't capture the broader concerns that we've been talking about here. So I would suggest we move away from that to begin with.
But to take you literally means we shouldn't use the term. We have to use the term. It's out there. We have to debunk the term, deconstruct it, go beyond it. But part of our job, and almost everything we're dealing with, there's a robust literature and so on, but part of our job and our charge is to say something about the ethics of neuroscience research and its use. And there, I think, in keeping everything consistent to everything you said, is that we look at the topic of cognitive enhancement and improve upon, from our commission's perspective, on the way it ought to be discussed. And everything you said after that, other than we shouldn't use the term, is consistent with the things we've been saying. We shouldn't buy into the term, but we need to recognize the way it's used. It's like, when we took on Craig Venter's notion that he was creating life, we shouldn't, we took it on in order to say he wasn't doing that.
So on this first point that I want to make, I'm not suggesting that we don't make reference to terms that people use in the literature. I'm suggesting we not use that as our own framework for the term as we discuss it. When we get to neuroscience and law, for example, many people call it neurolaw. I have problems with people doing neuro words for everything. And so I think what I'm proposing is we don't stay within the framework, since the concerns that we've addressed are much broader in scope. The motor coordination ones and motor enhancement ones, moral enhancement, each of these I think would be much more useful if we could start a new dialogue about the broader issues that we're concerned about, rather than trying to stay within a label that has been self-defeating in many ways. The second issue is, I want to endorse the recommendation that Steve made about factcheck.org. I'd say a broader and kind of the most valuable thing, I think, that is consistent with what we've proposed in past reports is this idea that information forcing types of recommendations or information forcing types of approaches are incredibly valuable, and especially in this area, because there's a lot of conflicting data out there about the value of brain training games, about all sorts of different things, and people who are in many cases desperate because they are noticing cognitive decline, or they're facing dementia or Alzheimer's or things like that, are investing a tremendous amount of money in snake oil. And so I think having something like factcheck.org would be extremely valuable in empowering people to make better choices about their use of limited resources. On the distributive justice concerns, if we go the direction of neuromodification, and this will tie into the next issue, I'm going to talk about the fallacy that Dan raises. This is true of every area. This isn't something special or unique about neuromodification. Everything we do modifies our brain in some ways and modifies our brain in permanent ways. Simply being here present today does so. Drinking tea, having education, having good access to food, having health care, all of these things have powerful effects on our neural state. And so the kind of answer of every new opportunity to stop distributive justice concerns to me is a kind of hollow approach to policymaking. And I'm not sure that saying that things like we should all have equitable access to neuromodifications is either meaningful or productive as a conversation in this area. So talking about structural changes to try to make sure everybody has access to it, it's far more complex than that. Just as one example, some of the studies on modafinil show that people who are at the lower end of the bell curve enjoy greater improvement in cognition than people who are at the higher end. And so what would equitable access in that context mean, given that there's a differential effect in how much improvement you could expect from any particular thing? So I think I would recommend we stay away from kind of empty rhetoric in that area. On the fallacy point that Dan raises, I think I disagree. And I disagree because I think there are unique concerns that different modalities of neuromodification raise. And those concerns for me are primarily safety, efficacy, permanency. But they're not really about naturalness or authenticity or things like that, because again, I believe everything we do changes our brain in some ways. And the idea that there's something suspect about a brain implant and not suspect about caffeine, to me, is more about social norms of what we've embraced and become comfortable with, rather than being particularly concerned of anything at any other end of the continuum. So I don't think it's false that we recognize these things as continuum. I think it's accurate to say that one of the problems that has stymied the debate and conversation in this area is the fact that it's so hard to draw a line anywhere along what is a continuum, since everything in fact does enhance the brain. And so that's part of what persuades me that this isn't as big of an issue, is that things that we've already come to accept that weren't previously accepted are on the same continuum of trying to improve human flourishing. And in this area, which is so different than other areas from my perspective, enhancement or modification is about flourishing. The last thing I want to talk about is a potential issue on regulation and ways to a specific type of recommendation that we might contemplate. One problem in areas of improvement of health or prevention or overall kind of enhancing drugs or devices is that the traditional mode of regulation looks at risks and benefits, but it's very difficult to quantify the benefit to any particular individual of a modification that improves them over their existing status. And so our existing regulatory models, which were designed for therapeutic purposes but not for beneficial purposes, limit the ability of different drugs and products to get to the marketplace, which to me is a bigger problem of access than any of the more traditional structural problems of access in this domain. And so trying to evaluate and come up with a new model of how we might approve and get to market in a safe and efficacious way these different drugs, recognizing that benefit may need a new meaning in this context, I think could be a valuable and pretty concrete thing forward.
Barbara, and then we're going to wrap up this session and go to the next because time is limited.
Just a quick response, since I was...
Really quick.
No, just to say that I'm not sure that we disagree, actually. All I'm suggesting, what's fallacious, is to conclude from the fact that there is a continuum, that therefore everything is morally permissible along the continuum. And I think that you might want to make, all you have to do is say that you have to make an argument for a particular place along the continuum. And that's what the fallacy is, that you can't automatically conclude logically.
But we have to agree that there is a continuum, whether we have to draw lines, but you can't say there is no continuum.
No, absolutely.
I'm sorry, I
absolutely.
don't have the right thing. We have to...
We have till noon in this
Okay,
session.
sorry, I'm working on an old timeline here, so I now have the new timeline. Great, okay. Barbara?
I've been interested in the research questions that you would ask around this. And it's not a simple area to be doing research in, I think, mostly because a lot of scientists wouldn't agree that some of the ways off-label that these drugs are being used or being proposed are worthwhile for scientific research studies or clinical trials. And so maybe would have trouble even passing a human subjects committee in some of these kinds of areas if you tried to propose studies looking at at how college students might use multiple drugs or things like that. But I think that one of the things that might be useful is to actually do comparisons with the ordinary sleeping and exercise and diet kinds of things as opposed to drug use, and actually finding some data on whether there really is an enhancement over and above, not just comparing it to nothing, but comparing it to things that are simple things that can be done, that can be useful for everybody and everybody has access to.
So Steve raised the question, so Steve began, I thought, the whole thing was extremely useful, Steve and Anita, so thank you both. Begins with a whole range of examples of what people often refer to when they're referring to cognitive enhancement, and then goes on, and this is where I think we're in heated agreement, then goes on to say we need to broaden this to the range of ways the human nervous system can be enhanced. And also, Nita and Dan agree that there is a continuum of ways. Doesn't mean because there's a continuum, all are equally, good or bad or efficacious or non-efficacious. In fact, we know they're not, right? So that's very helpful. And I think we can really run with that and broaden the understanding and the debate. I think one of the most important aspects of this part of the report is what Steve said, promoting an informed public. And I think we should run with that. Now, Steve, you asked a question, and I'd like to open it up for you, how you would answer it and how anyone on the commission would answer it. Is there anything in this area? So we said there's nothing, enhancing cognition is not in itself suspect, and there's a range of dealing with cognition, improving it, and if you improve cognition, you could be doing it therapeutically, or you can be doing it where it's not, no doctor is going to prescribe it, but you make your cognition better either in a given instance or overall than it would otherwise be. But here's the question. Is there an equivalent in this area to human cloning? That's what you asked. And there are all these, is it the human cyborg, which isn't the equivalent of cloning, because when cloning came about, there was a clone of a sheep named Dolly, and that raised the real question. So I'm just throwing that out first for Steve. Is there some, let me tone it down a bit, if not an equivalent, what's the analogy here to human cloning, and to what extent is it equivalent?
Well, if I knew that answer, I would have framed it in a declarative rather than rather than as a question. I again would go back to the beginning of some of our deliberations where we lead in our first volume that there is nothing unique about these questions that we are asking in the neurosciences, but in some aspects they come into sharper focus. And the concept of making an individual's genome permanent, the human cloning concept is certainly the beyond the bell curve and something that is formally prohibitive. So what if we were to begin with the possibility that neuromodulation, and one could argue whether this is enhancement or not, presumably the purpose of it is that the function and ability to live in your environment is enhanced by the manipulation. So even if it's decreasing the role of an attribute that is unhealthy for that goal. It would potentially be functionally enhancement. So what if we were to say, off the cuff, that that manipulations that are not permanent or are not transferred to progeny are more reasonable than manipulations that become a permanent external entity. This is, I guess, the equivalent might be in genetics, where what about gene therapy? Is gene therapy that enhances a genome different from a cassette that does not get integrated in the genome?
Yeah. Could I go in a totally different direction? Because I don't think, I think the distinction between improving the working of the human mind such that it's in some way permanent versus temporary or somewhere, I don't think there's a good bad verse here. So in the literature and in the debate out there, the closest equivalent I can find to human cloning, and it isn't human, it is in the cognition sphere, and that is the debate over whether you can create a computer that thinks just like a human being. In other words, whether it is possible to have, and if it were, whether it's possible to create an entity that is just like a human being as because it thinks just like a human being. And there's a robust debate
Huge literature.
about
The
that.
singularity, right?
And I don't think, there's no, it turns out that there's a Turing test, and it yet hasn't been passed. But there's a robust debate that even if you could pass the Turing test, it would still be the equivalent of a human being. And it's a very esoteric, it's an esoteric debate. It's a really important philosophical debate. It has real practical import because it has to do with just what you said, Steve, whether other aspects of human thinking, which have to do with emotions and control over behavior and the ability to express oneself in a way that is not, is part of our consciousness, is important. But there is a big literature out there and a lot of concern that in our age of thinking about how to manipulate the mind, we're forgetting what the difference is between a machine and a human being. And that overlaps with the DALL-E debate. Okay, so I think it's important to put it out there because it's really it's going to be part of the debate moving forward.
Just to follow up on the things that we're frightened of. So the DALL-E debate analog, could be the machine that has the capacity of human cognition. But the other, I think, scary line that we may not want to cross is where you have a human being who's been manipulated such that they no longer experience negative emotions or regret, sadness, their painful memories, Nita mentioned it, are dispelled. I think we would, to me, that's a DALL-E moment when it's possible to do that and we're tempted to do it. And it may be that it's not a germline change, it's just a change in one person. But the idea of human beings who are just like us, except that they're not burdened by pain, regret, sadness, et cetera, that to me is something of ethical import. And it's even perhaps more imaginable than the brain that has a human capacity.
Raju?
So trying to think of answering, Steve's question. I can't think of any, actually. And even this issue about the cloning and so on and so forth, that's a social construct. I mean, in the present society, right? That's not considered to be appropriate.
But we can all agree, but
it happens all the time.
social constructs are important.
No, I understand, but social constructs can also change, and they do change. In terms of cloning, for example, identical twins, this is the nature's way of cloning. That's exactly what happens. So I'm not sure they're absolutes. I mean, if you consider in this neural area, for example, right? People with, schizophrenia were sort of, put into ice cold water baths, right? I mean, that was considered to be okay. If you ask me today, I would say absolutely that's inappropriate. Or doing frontal lobotomy would be considered to be okay 40 years ago. It would not be considered to be okay today. So I think things change, so that I don't think there's any absolute thing that you would be able to say in terms of, this particular subject that should be considered to be, absolutely morally wrong.
My moral philosopher has to say, we are speaking as the Bioethics Commission today. The fact that, and you said, you think this is absolutely wrong with regard to lobotomy, we have to say what we believe today. That's the same thing with science. The evidence changes. We don't know what 100 years from now scientific evidence will tell us, but we have to do the best we can today.
I guess, Amy, the distinction that we have to make is that, so therefore there is no absolute. That's what I'm saying. Because when science changes, our social constructs will also change, so that actually says there is not an absolute thing.
We don't have, that depends on what you mean by absolute. It is absolutely wrong to commit genocide. And there are other absolutes too, in the sense that we know them as well as we could know anything. And we can't imagine a human world in which that would not be the case. There are a lot of things that we could imagine changing. I think it's...
There's a lot of thinking about that, at least in my own, simple-minded way of thinking about that, is that, killing would be considered to be absolutely immoral. But clearly there are circumstances under which killing is considered to be okay, or even approved. So that's what I'm saying, that, the context is important, but there is probably no absolute.
Nita.
I think that the long-term, short-term, or the future generation issue actually reveals to us a different issue rather than it being the issue itself. So I think thinking about the harm to others and the harms to future generations is important. I mean, one debate that happens quite a bit in the enhancement debate is, libertarian principles versus paternalistic principles, self-autonomy and decisions that a person can make for themselves versus the harm that it causes to others. And so to both Steve's point and Anita's point, I'm not troubled by a single individual who, for example, suffers a rape being offered the option of taking propranolol to dampen their fear memories and to decrease their risk of developing PTSD. But I would be troubled with an entire society having in the water propranolol after 9/11, so that our social construct and understanding of what happened and our fear and inhibitions about things would occur. And so I think what the long-term and short-term issues and whether or not there are certain things that are off limits has a little bit more to do with who's making the choice. Are we imposing the choice on another person, or are we given the choice, and what are the consequences to the choice we might be able to make on others? And so I think the harm principle in libertarianism is a useful limitation in this context to understand what are the social consequences of individuals being able to do neural modifications, and if those are grave, then we need to be concerned about them. And so for future generations, if there was something neural modification-wise that would pose some sort of risk to future generations, then I'd be concerned about it. I'm not aware of anything in that context yet, but something similar would be, I'm concerned about the use or the imposition of drugs or devices on children where we don't understand what the long-term implications are. So thinking about doing increasing activation in one area of the brain, which might come at a consequence of a different area of the brain, so that you have a child who's very good at some particular function but loses some other function over time. We do that anyway with reading and other types of functions, but as we think about more direct brain interventions, I think understanding who the actor is and who gets to make the choice and what the social consequences are is to me the bigger issue, the consequence of which and some of the dimensions of which may be long-term, short-term, whether or not there's fear memories or other types of memories modified.
Good. That's very, I think that builds on this. I have Jim and then Dan.
I've listened almost entirely to this, and I'm actually troubled by the direction of the conversation and the scope of the conversation. And correct me, please, if I'm wrong. I think much of what we've been talking about is, in some ways, and I'll try to support this, some ways out of character for how we have discussed other issues, and I think perhaps even beyond the scope. The scope that we've been asked to address, right, is the direction of research for the BRAIN project. No, right? That's not. How would you?
No, actually, the scope is that plus the use of neuroscience more generally
that's where
in
that's
society.
where I'm,
it's very much that.
Let's make sure that's right, Amy, though, because I'm concerned when I say out of character, we have drifted into the realm that I associate with something that we addressed before and actually discharged, and that was the precautionary principle that says one shouldn't even consider doing research in areas that could lead to applications that we can imagine being detrimental, right? I think we have a lot to contribute, and I hope, even if I'm wrong, and we should be talking so heavily about applications, speculative and demonstrably possible, even if I'm wrong, and we should be talking about those things, there is another rich conversation that we need to have in this area about where the knowledge gaps are that can help us ethically inform future uses. And in the past, our character has been to say that we don't find the pursuit of knowledge immoral in and of itself. In fact, we have assumed it's amoral to pursue knowledge. And if we don't have a conversation, shame on us if we don't have a conversation also about what we think the gaps are that may or may not, are not currently being addressed in the research directions in which we're going. And I'm concerned that we've jumped ahead in a very seductive conversation and set of conversations that may keep us from fulfilling, if not the principal charge, which I had assumed, but if it's not the principal charge, it's at least an important component of our charge of how we would guide research and what the ethical questions would be in neuroscience
I think
research and
that
technology.
I think that what set this off is the question of, is there something like Dolly? And it was not meant, oh, no, okay, so.
Well, that's okay. No, go
maybe.
ahead.
No, I don't want to go ahead because I want to figure out what set it off, because I think that for sure our charge is broader than neuroscience research. And if it isn't broader, then we're pretty much done with our deliberations, because the first report pretty much said what needed to be said there, with the exception of some more specific things that we will say about neuroscience research. But it is part of our charge, and also I think really incumbent on us as a bioethics commission to try to clarify, for the sake of public education, which I dare say is our best hope here now, what some of the misunderstandings are out there, and what are some of the potential, consistent with the our principles. So I,
Let me, I hear you, and I appreciate the correction. If that's the case, then let's be really confident also that cognitive enhancement, consent issues, and intersections of law and neuroscience are the three big categories, and we explain why it is that we are not going to talk about other categories. For example, the greatest uses, presumably, which will be therapeutic uses, that we don't have a fourth category, and we can probably think of 5 or 6. I had understood these three to be wonderful vehicles to help explore some of the key ethical questions about how it is we want to go about getting the kind of knowledge that would impact not just these three, but more broadly. So I understood these as vehicles rather than we think these are the key applications that we need to understand the ethical
so
implications.
let me try to clarify what I think we can do here. First of all, they're not the key applications.
I didn't think they were.
Right, and we're not picking them because they're the key applications, and they're only part of our report. They are 3 cauldrons of controversy, if you will, which we can help shed light on and clarify. Some of them all of them will have potentials for more research. We've already uncovered one here, which is what are the actual uses and risks and benefits in the way we should be broaden the category of all of these cognitive enhancers, and also really change the way we think about that. But to get to your central point, this isn't all of what we've deliberated about or what we'll discuss in the report. We're also going to discuss the important positive research areas that are not necessarily and often aren't the most controversial.
Good, and I, again, appreciate the clarification. I do, and correct me on this, the BRAIN project, though, as far as I know, all of the dollars, now up to what, 300 million, are being made available. Wasn't there just an announcement a couple weeks ago that BRAIN was up to 300 million? Are being made available for research.
Yep.
And so guiding how those $300 million go in an ethical way, I think is a role that I understood to be the key role that we're being asked to play. So.
I wish we had the power to guide the way we will
Well,
recommend.
you know what I meant.
No, but
Yeah.
we will recommend, and that is important. But if that's all we do, we're writing a report to a group of funders who may or may not take our suggestions, may or may not even, be, and that's not what, and the reason it's really important that we deliberate about this now is that we need and we owe it publicly to have a deliberation about this, as well as our recommendations, some of which we've already made, and we'll make some more about funding. I'm going to keep John's next on the list. Dan? Oh, Dan? Oh, sorry, you're right. Dan's next on the list.
First, I actually am enjoying this conversation because I think that it is within our scope, and I think that it's one of these issues that's controversial enough that we actually disagree with each other on certain parts of it, which is actually good for deliberation and may be helpful because we can have this kind of a conversation. And in the interest of trying to move it forward, I've been struck by Nita's question about is the term enhancement the wrong one, and maybe to sort of help clarify things, maybe we need to come up with some other better covering term, and one that comes to mind for me that might cover all of what Steve said, for instance, would be something like functional neurological improvements. which would cover both therapy from less than 2 standard deviations below the mean into the normal range, but could cover these things that are beyond that as well, which are typically what some people mean by enhancements. It could cover motor things, et cetera. And part of what we could do is say, this is what we're talking about, and within this, under this covering term, there's a range of different interventions, modalities that might be undertaken, some of which raise different ethical questions than others, and that's maybe a better way to frame the conversation and the argument. Maybe there's a better, this is not my area, maybe there's a better term already out there in the literature, but if there isn't, something like this might be good. So.
John?
Just a codicil to this conversation. I mean, I think that kind of linguistic substitution might work in a lot of cases, but I don't think it would work in the case of memory attenuation. I mean, that's not an improvement of memory. It's a kind of disabling of memory. So, but anyway,
we could talk about that
we
as a
can
kind of
certainly,
functional improvement by diminishment. Just as we treat anxiety, we decrease a certain pathology.
Yeah.
These are considered improvements by decreasing certain kinds of...
improvement in terms of quality of life, and Okay, so a couple of small points, mostly for staff writing these reports up. One is I want to state my agreement with Nita on the question of long-term, versus short-term. But just for those who are writing this up, there is a very robust literature out there on on the ethics of, say, germline therapy versus somatic cell therapy. I can tell you firsthand from a rather unpleasant exchange that I had with George Annis. Actually, Elizabeth Fenton and I engaged in a debate with Annis on just that question. And people like Annis and Fukuyama are very clear that this is like, talk about Dali moments. I mean, they would say that any tinkering with the germline or anything that's going to be extended into future generations is really bad because it's going to undermine human nature.
That's important because we have talked about that in the synthetic biology, and it is not the line you draw. And so that actually is the less science fiction-y, it's not science fiction at all, answer to Steve's, the question I threw out. We have a position on that. And it's not that something that will make a difference down, the line is inherently suspect.
Now, Amy, if you want a science fiction analog to Dali, I'll give it to you, and that's the Transhumanist Manifesto, right?
Yeah, no, but I don't want it.
Nick Bostrom, that whole, okay.
I mean,
I'm just trying to be helpful here, okay?
Right. Thanks.
I would just like to say two things in response to Jim's comments, which were, I think, very helpful to me. And the first is, the first is the concept about using neuroscience for therapy, which is so important, and the question is it obvious? And that's why we're focusing on enhancement. And just to go back for the younger people in the audience, the original congressional charter to the NIH was not to carry out outstanding science, but to relieve suffering and to extend the lifespan of healthy living, of healthy existence. And I think everything that, or most things that I can imagine that neuroscience would contribute to relieving suffering in someone with schizophrenia or someone with a clear disease would be front and center aligned with the original charge. Yes. Now, the first question is, that we've discussed this morning, where is that boundary? Mm-hmm. And I think nobody has answers, but if we could frame that in a useful way for public debate, that would be really, I think, important for us. And then the second point that Jim made about the BRAIN initiative specifically, and this is a question to the Commission. The BRAIN initiative is magnificent for its goals, but it is not all neuroscience. It's a limited sector of neuroscience. It does not include many, for example, of the therapeutic opportunities that are at shorthand for some of these terrible diseases. And there is concern that Walter Koroshet's raised, that others raised, that the focus on the BRAIN initiative could actually decrease our momentum in some other areas. So the second question is this a statement that somehow we think is important enough to be in the report?
Yeah, we can talk about that some more, but I think it's a very compelling suggestion that you have. It is noon, and we need to adjourn for lunch, and we'll come back, and since Steve began it, I think we'll let him, for now, have the last word. But I do want to thank Steve and Anita for really getting us off to an excellent start. So thank you very, very much. And we will reconvene at 1 o'clock.